Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome back to our discussion on addiction and recovery. Yesterday we spoke about the um, the various consequences that we experience through addiction or compulsive behavior, even just obsessive thought, right? And today we're going to move on to understanding the role that our family played in where we might be currently relative to our addictive behavior. We'll also be looking at an abuse checklist. The abuse checklist is interesting because, again, many of us have grown up with certain behaviors that, for the most part, we normalize what we experience and wouldn't even necessarily consider it to be abusive simply because we weren't taught that the behavior is abusive or unhealthy. We just take it for granted that, oh, that's normal, right? And so we will touch on those two topics today. Just a point of distinction, previously I mentioned that children of alcoholics are genetically predisposed to becoming alcoholic, or rather, they're 9 times more genetically predisposed to becoming alcoholics than children whose parents aren't alcoholic. And the distinction here is simply that it's a predisposition, not a certainty. It doesn't mean because your parents are an alcoholic that you're going to become an alcoholic. Just the chance, or rather that the likelihood of you falling into that because of your predisposition to it is significantly higher. So yeah, it doesn't mean that because you are the son of an addict or related to an addict that all of a sudden, even the daughter of an addict, I have to be so mindful about like these terms, so that we don't overlook addiction, on the female side, because again, so often, especially in Cape Town, in South Africa, it's spoken about almost as a male problem. Even pornography addiction is considered more a male problem than it is a female problem. But if you look at the statistics, in terms of consumption, 35% of the users on Pornhub, for instance, are female. So they release statistics on the users, the demographics, and that kind of thing, and 35% female, and growing. So one of the things we have to consider is that this struggle that we face isn't simply a male problem. Yeah, let's leave it there for now. Right. So the exercise here is basically what you're going to do is you're going to go back 3 generations. So I invite you to look at who your parents are, then who your grandparents are, and your great grandparents. So you're going to go back 3 generations, and the reason behind it is that you may not recognize a certain behavior in within your immediate parents, but you may recognize that behavior in generations further up. It's also helpful to consider going across the family tree, not just up, to consider things like your aunts and uncles, or your the brothers and sisters of your grandparents, simply because those are people who have an influence in your life as well. If you think about a simple thing like physical abuse, right? The stats in South Africa that most of the cases of abuse of children, especially, are by a family member or a relative or someone that they know, someone close to the family. So if you think of trauma and abuse as one of those factors that affect our likelihood of falling into addiction, then we can't just go by parents, grandparents, can't just go straight up. We have to go across. So in terms of what you're going to be considering relative to each of these relatives is, were they alcoholic or addicted to a substance, like a drug addict, a compulsive gambler, anorexic or bulimic, so they have like eating disorders, whether a sex addict. Now, sex addict is, again, it's tricky because for the most part, this is something that's gone undiagnosed for many, many years. So how it might show up is, were they constantly unfaithful in their relationship? Did they have secret secret families? Were they caught often, with other women, with other men, or that kind of thing. So that's how the sex addiction might play out, in years gone by. Were they a victim of child abuse, a perpetrator of child abuse, a person with mental health problems, a person with some other compulsive or addictive behavior, such as overeating, overworking, compulsive spending, or extreme religiosity, or were they a co-addict, so married to or involved with an addict. Again, some of these things are a little bit hard to spot because we don't necessarily know the details of the lives of our grandparents or our great-grandparents. Many of us haven't ever met them, and so for the most part we go by hearsay. But for those who are fortunate enough to find out about them, these are some of the things to consider inquiring about. And we have to be mindful about how we go about this, because the intention isn't to dig up dirt on the family. The intention isn't to expose secrets. Where possible, it's to understand the role and the likelihood of how their behavior affected your behavior. And again, this isn't for us to blame our families. It's simply to help us make sense in terms of our story. Where did our story start? And why is this the struggle that I have? Right? So yeah, that's about it on the family front. What's interesting is, if you consider, I've got a little diagram here. I don't know if you can see it, but they start with with your mother or your father, and then your grandparents and great grandparents, and all told, that is 12, 16. That's approximately 26 people. And so if you consider, that's not even considering aunts and uncles and that kind of thing, right? So at the very least, there are potentially 26 people or one of 26 people who've had an influence in how we behave, which is really mind-boggling, because if we think about it, when we think about, the household we were raised in or the family we come from, very rarely do we consider the pool of influence to be that big. Right. So, when we look at, if we identify anyone, moving on from the family now, if we look at ourselves, and we identify problematic behavior or addictive behavior, then one of the things that's useful for us to do is to identify when the behavior started. So it's useful to write down, let's say in spaces of like 5 to 10 years at a time, what was our relationship like with that thing. So for instance, if you take food, for example, right, and you go 0 to 10. So 0 to 10, you don't really have much control over the purchasing of food, right? But you have, to an increasing degree, the ability to control your consumption of it. So you might say, growing up we didn't really have much, and always found that we had to share everything we had, and that's a story many people have in South Africa, because we came from a time of struggle, and our grandparents didn't have much, and perhaps we were immigrants or whatever. And so the story is, very often that it starts out, we didn't really have much. And then, as as time moved on, even though we now had the ability to earn, we were purchasing for ourselves, and we were, the food wasn't as scarce anymore. That didn't necessarily change our relationship with scarcity and food. Like, we might still think of food as being something that we need to consume now before someone else consumes it, and so we have like a scarcity mindset or a scarcity mentality around food. So that's one of the exercises for you to do. So you can do it around eating, the usage of substances, even engaging in sex. A sexual history is an exercise very few engage in, but it's especially important because many of us, and again, I'm using South Africa as a base because the majority of our audience currently is South African. Many of us have experienced sexual abuse, but won't necessarily include it in a sexual history. Right? We tend to think of our sexual history as when we decided to first engage in sexual activity, but that's not necessarily all of what our sexual history is. So it's important for us to go, way back, as early as we can remember, to what were our first experiences with sex, what were our first, the first events that we can remember, and again, this gets tricky because it might fall into the realm of, oh God, there was this time when I was exploring, and there was this time when I was abused, or it might bring up a lot of shame. And the point here isn't to again dig out dirt or do this for the purpose of feeling shameful, but rather for the purpose of understanding. It's really important that we reinforce this idea that this whole journey is for the purpose of us drawing closer to Allah, for the purpose of us understanding what are our triggers, so that if in fact we do experience a trigger later on, that we can understand the context. Why is this happening, and what can I do about it, and so that I don't fall into the same sin over and over and over and over and over again. Right? So you can look at on the co-addictive side as well. So perhaps it's not you that's the addict, but maybe you grew up with a parent that was an addict, or an uncle that was an addict, or relatives that were an addict, and here, especially in the larger families, like and again, relative to Cape Town, many of us grew up with our cousins, whether it's living in the same home or just spending lots of time with him. And so, how did their behavior affect us? What was our exposure to a thing? Because even something as simple as just being exposed to information already potentially sparks a curiosity. It sparks, ideas of experimenting. It sparks our beliefs about a certain thing, whether it's okay or not okay. Whether I hide it, don't hide it. Who I choose to have relationships with going forward, based on how exciting was this relationship, and what did it do for me, and what did I get from it, and what does it mean to me, etc., etc. So that's on the family front, right? Now, again, as children, we don't necessarily recognize what is unusual behavior. For instance, many of us may hear stories of older relatives, so we call it, uncles or grandfathers, and we'd say, this guy, he had such a temper, and if someone came into his shop and caused trouble, and then it plays out almost like a cowboy story, and it can be entertaining and enthralling, and wow, he must have been such a guy and such a manly man, whatever, not necessarily recognizing that perhaps he was a rageaholic, or perhaps he was abusive. On one side we can look at his behavior as now he was protecting his family, and he was or protecting his shop, and he was just a short-tempered guy, and we hear the stories relative to the shop, but do we hear the stories, or have we thought about how did that temper play out at home? Were his children, what was his children the relationship like with his children? Was he open and loving, warm and friendly, or was he, equally as short-tempered at home? So, for this purpose, we engage in the abuse checklist. Studies have shown that there's a very high correlation between childhood emotional, physical, and sexual abuse and subsequent addiction. Again, because if we're exposed to an environment that makes us feel bad or traumatizes us, the need to self-soothe is going to be that much higher. And chances are that, again, we haven't been given the tools or taught how to soothe in a healthy way. And so we'd more than likely fall into addictive behavior. Right, so the part of the exercise, the way to structure it is to consider that if you've experienced any of the forms of abuse that I'm going to mention, ask yourself 3 questions. At what age did it happen? What was the frequency at which it happened? And then, who was the abusing person? Right? We're still good? Okay. And the reason you want to ask this question is so that we can understand how long we were subjected to it, the intensity of it, because sometimes there may be something that we don't consider really traumatic, like if a parent, for instance, lashes out you, beats you up one day, and swears at you and calls you a good for nothing so and so, then wow, that's like traumatic, and that might sit with you for a while. But it's equally possible for a parent who's critical and just constantly questions your judgment and says, you don't really make such good decisions, and to do that over a period of 20, 30 years. Perhaps you don't really experience it as abusive or traumatic or whatever, but there's no doubt that it can have an impact on your self-confidence, your self-esteem, your ability to in fact make decisions going forward. Because perhaps when you need to make a decision, the thought comes to your mind, or that voice comes to your mind, you're not so good at making decisions, you need to ask someone else, you need to consult, you need to do whatever. So frequency or intensity is important to understand, because again, something could be mild, but over a long period have a significant effect. So the abuse is broken up, again, much like we did with the consequences: emotional, physical, spiritual. The abuse is structured in the same way. So under emotional abuse, the first thing is neglect. So our parents or our guardians, those significant persons who were emotionally unavailable or even physically unavailable, basically that the care that we received was inadequate, right? Being on the receiving end of harassment or malicious tricks. And so while yes, we are talking about the first part of this talk was about family and the role the family played, harassment and malicious tricks can be even in terms of going to school, teachers, or other pupils, or any environment we find ourselves in. Even if it's a sport that we played, maybe it's the coach, or maybe it's other parents on the team, or other kids, and that kind of thing. So over here, when we're looking at abuse, we're considering really any and everyone that was in your life. Being screamed or shouted at, unfair punishments. So sometimes the punishment doesn't really meet the crime. And you hear this especially amongst the older generation, that if we spoke back, then we just get we smacked through the face, all right? And so and here many people differ in terms of what is an appropriate response. How do you discipline your child? You need to be talking more. And so many, if you listen to so many other comedians, especially comedians of color, will refer to the difference in parenting styles or techniques or discipline styles between parents of color and white parents. White parents, the joke usually goes that, it's go to your room and think about what you've done and we'll talk about it later. Whereas, parents of color would just like whack you upside the head. And so, unfair punishments, cruel or degrading tasks, cruel confinement, so being locked in a cupboard or being locked in a room. I've heard some just brutal stories of where people put children that they believe to be naughty, and some of it can be like really traumatic. Abandonment, a lack of supervision, a lack of security, being left or deserted somewhere, even just the passing of a parent, you can experience that as abandonment. So death or divorce of your primary caregivers. Then touch deprivation, and sometimes this is spoken about a little bit too flippantly. They say, oh yeah, I wasn't, you weren't hugged enough as a child. And the reality is that can in fact be something that affects you. You can, whether you experience it traumatic or abusive or neglectful, it has an effect, right? So touch deprivation, overly strict dress codes. We see examples or hear examples of it in our community. And again, it's difficult to speak about because on the one hand, yes, you want to appreciate hijab and what's appropriate and that kind of thing, but on the other hand, sometimes we go too far, or especially the policing of it at home goes too far. And again, here we might rack it up to a lack of education or a lack of proper understanding of what's appropriate, what's allowed, and then obviously there's this culture and that kind of thing that feeds into this whole thing. But yeah, overly strict dress codes, a lack of privacy. So yes, while it's important to maintain a watchful eye over your children, it's a whole other thing to invade their privacy. So things like reading your children's diaries or scratching through their belongings, and seeing what they're up to. And here it doesn't mean that because it's theirs that you have no right to, or that you shouldn't do it. It can still be done, but perhaps with agreement, perhaps with consent. In cases where you are genuinely concerned that maybe it's like a life or death situation, or because their behavior is like really erratic or whatever, then okay, fine, perhaps, right? But some people just make a habit of it, to overstep the boundaries, to open whatever is in their children's room, and they just feel like it's my house, my rules, and so nothing's off limits to me. And how does a child then develop a sense of what is a healthy boundary if at home there are no boundaries? They're not allowed to enforce any boundaries of their own. And this is really important, because then they grow up and then don't know how to enforce healthy boundaries with their spouses or with their friends. So privacy, having to hide injuries or wounds from others, and here it's probably more likely that it's going to be the victim of physical abuse would have to do something like that. Being forced to keep secrets, and here in our communities, especially the Muslim community, and there's this idea of, no, we don't talk outside the house, and we don't talk to others about the family problems, and so the problem has to stay in the home and amongst the family. The problem, though, is that, and I'm going to say something that might not sit well with many people, but especially with the victims of sexual abuse, more often than not, the people that they turn to confide in, like parents, for instance, aren't necessarily equipped to support them properly, and so are then more worried about, oh God, what if this information gets out about the family? What's it going to do to the family? So when an uncle, for instance, is sexually abusing a nephew or a niece, and that child now goes to their parent and go, so this is what Uncle so and so did to me, or Auntie so and so, because again, this isn't a male problem. We've seen, as perhaps not as many, but many examples of females engaging in abuse as well. And so the story usually goes, either they get victim shamed, and so it's like, no, you must have done something to make them behave in that way, so you must have prompted it, or it's no, but now it's your word against theirs, and so where do we go from there? Or I can't just go around accusing someone. Perhaps the parent themselves doesn't have the ability to confront, like maybe they're just non-confrontational, and so as much as they are concerned about their child, they perhaps don't have it within them to confront the family member. Or I've heard things like, no, but this is just going to push the family apart further if they find out that Uncle so and so did this to one of the nephews and nieces, and again, or Auntie so and so. So just being forced to keep secrets, having to take on adult responsibilities as a child. Now, usually you see this play out with alcoholics. So they don't really, they're not necessarily functioning properly. So perhaps in the morning they're still hungover, and so they aren't able to get the kids ready for school and that kind of thing. And so maybe the older siblings have to take care of the younger siblings. Now, there's a distinction here because, especially in families where both parents work, or sort of in the older generations, because of large families, perhaps the parents couldn't attend to all the children, so it's customary perhaps for older siblings to help out with the younger siblings, right? But there's a distinction here between helping out and having to bear the responsibilities of an adult, right? Having to watch the beating of other family members, and so someone was naughty and then they get hiding in front of everybody, and one of those things is like, it's used as an intimidation technique, and okay, if they see the one get hiding, they'll all be bang. And if you think about growing up, for those of you who were at school when corporal punishment was still allowed, everyone got hiding in front of everyone else. It wasn't, okay, you stand outside the class and then you're going to go get a whack outside the class. You're going to get a whack in front of everybody. And that can be traumatic for some, just watching others get beaten. Being caught in the middle of parents' fights. This one's like all too common. Being blamed for family problems. Often the older ones in the family get blamed for the behavior of the younger ones, as if their behavior has any bearing on the behavior of the younger ones. And so you'll hear things like, no, you're the eldest, you should be setting an example, or you should know better, or whatever. Meanwhile, the kid is maybe only a year or two older than their sibling, not even thinking about, something I do is now going to be attributed to something they do, or their behavior is suddenly just going to be attributed to me without me having any involvement in that particular activity. Then physical abuse. There's we have kicking, shoving, slapping or hitting, scratches or bruises, burns. You often hear of like cigarette burns, cuts or wounds, broken bones or fractures, damage to internal organs, permanent injury, beatings or whippings, like caning, that kind of thing. Inadequate medical attention. You might hear something along the lines of, man, you're a big boy, or you're a man, just shrug it off, or just walk it off, or you'll feel better in a few days. Do you know how expensive it is to go to the doctor? That kind of thing. As how expensive it is potentially irrelevant. The bigger concern is, did you get the appropriate or the necessary medical attention? Then pulling and grabbing of hair and ears like I don't know where you are in the world, or if that was a thing for you, but growing up there was a lot of like ear pulling as a form of discipline. As if that made sense somehow. right? It's like sort of a better version than giving a hiding or lesser version of it. And then inadequate food or nutrition. And here, it might not even be deliberate. If you think about parents who have an eating disorder or generally just eat junk or eat unhealthy, it's not necessarily their intention to feed their children unhealthy food. They just generally don't have the capacity to maintain giving their child a healthy diet. Right? So a lot of people just think, well, I'm providing food, I'm putting food on the table. I'm not necessarily thinking about how healthy or unhealthy the food is. And then culturally even, if you think about, like in the Indian community, there's a lot of cooking with very rich substances like butter and oil and that kind of thing. And even though cholesterol is a huge problem in the Indian community, that's just what the recipe says, or that's just the way we were taught. And so it's not an intentionally harmful or deliberately abusive thing when one of the elders cooks in that way. That's just how they cook. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we don't experience it as like abusive, for instance. So food and nutrition. Then sexual abuse. Here, it doesn't just include like penetrative sex or direct contact. Even things like flirtatious and suggestive language can fall under sexual abuse. And so we have to be really mindful of how, if it's not us and our language, we have to be mindful even of for our children or for just younger people in the family, how others speak to them, and there's a difference here between giving a compliment and being inappropriate, right? So flirtatious or suggestive language, propositioning. So even though something may not have actually transpired, something as simple as a proposition may be traumatic. Because let's say it's someone you really trust, and especially for a child, right? So if you think of a teacher, whether that's secular or religious, a sports coach, or any activity that they're involved in, someone that they look up to, propositioning them sexually, right? Inappropriate holding or kissing. And here we have to be mindful of that insistence of perhaps an older relative, come sit on my lap kind of thing. It can be inappropriate. Or kisses, insisting that. And there's been a huge outcry of late, allowing children or teaching children that it's okay to say no when a family member wants you to give them a kiss. And so often amongst the older generations, it's seen as disrespectful if you don't want to kiss, this aunt or that granny or whatever. But the reality is that we live in a time where there are many predators around, and so we have to start to teach our children what is or rather about their boundaries and enforcing that boundaries. And if you look amongst the in certain cultures and communities, they practice, instead of kissing on the face or the lips or whatever, out of a sign of respect, they kiss a hand, right? And so it's a much clearer boundary than kisses on the face or close to the lips and that kind of thing. Then sexual fondling, masturbation, oral sex, forced sexual activity, household voyeurism, or inappropriate household nudity. Like you hear stories about kids growing up and then their parents would just walk around in their underwear or in less than that. So that could be traumatic. Sexual hugs, jokes about your body. And here, this is especially for adolescents, coming of age, when for boys they start to develop facial hair, or their voice starts to deepen, or when women they start to get a little bit more curvaceous, or their breasts start to show and that kind of thing. And so now all of a sudden, sometimes people think it's open season, it's okay to make comments about the changes their bodies are going through, or to joke about it, that kind of thing, right? Use of sexualizing language, penetration with objects, bestiality, criticism of your physical or sexual development. So sometimes it's not jokes, sometimes it's done in a very critical way, like look how you turning out, and like, why do you look like that, and like you find that sometimes when people comment about you being overweight, they'll touch your stomach, for instance. It's like they can't just say, oh, you look like you've gained a couple of pounds. As inappropriate as that is, they'll still go further to actually touch your stomach. Consider for a moment, right, just what that actually is, man. You're invading someone else's space and then touching their body to make a point that is really none of your business, right? And so that can have an effect on someone. That could be like really traumatizing, or at the very least, scarring. Yeah. And then anyone else, really, again, it's not limited to family or friends, but the preoccupation with your sexual development. And this can be even, like it comes in the form of, and again, so much is passed over as humor. I'm not trying to be the guy who, says, this and that isn't funny, but sometimes it's inappropriate. Like, when you start talking about, oh, do you have a girlfriend yet, or do you have a boyfriend, or the boys must be looking at you, because look how you look, and look how you dress, and that kind of thing. And really, more often than not, it's thinly veiled comments about that person's own observation. Like what you're really saying when you ask a girl, let's say you have a young niece or something, who's now developed into a young woman, and you start talking about, oh, the boys must be like crazy about you. On one level, you're acknowledging your attraction to that person, which can be very inappropriate, right? So, if you do find yourself having these thoughts or having these conversations, try as best as you can to really just keep it to yourself. That person doesn't need to know that you think that they're attractive. They don't need to know that you have a concern over whether they have a boyfriend, not a boyfriend, or anything like that. Their sexual development is exactly that. It's their development. There's absolutely nothing to do with you, right? So, yeah, again, relative to some of these things, you may not have experienced it in any blatant form, in any overt or obvious form, and may not even be very intense, maybe like very subtle, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's any less traumatic for you. On this point, I really feel the need to emphasize that this experience of abuse or trauma is a subjective one. There isn't like an objective view on what trauma or abuse is, because each of us are built differently, we're structured differently, we think differently, we feel differently. And so what could be a harmless prank to one person could be something that's really scarring to another. And so if you feel that you were abused, if you feel that someone was inappropriate with you or whatever, then my advice to you is simply reach out, get help, speak about it, break the cycle of shame, break the cycle of abuse, get the help that you need, and don't minimize it, don't think less of it, don't think, oh, but that's what was happening at the time, so it was okay. Just because everyone else got a hiding in the class doesn't mean the fact that you got a hiding and found it traumatic to be any less traumatic because it was the norm, right? So with this, we encourage that I encourage you to reach out, speak out, share. Someone asked a question about what is the impact of a child growing up uh, in a home that's abusive, and very often you hear the term or the phrase hurt people, which is to say that the cycle of abuse perpetuates itself, that when one generation passes it on to the next, the likelihood is that that will continue. Someone shared an incident with me, and I share it because I think there's a lot of value in it. They said that, and this isn't someone who doesn't know better or is uneducated or anything like that, right? This is like a really well-educated person, very successful, etc., etc. And they shared the story that, a family member kissed them inappropriately at the age of 10, right? And then what they found was that when someone in their family, obviously now younger than them, turned 10, they kissed that person. And then they caught themselves and they thought, wow, oh my gosh, why did I just do that? And upon reflection, they realized that an incident that long ago in their lives affected, the age at which they thought or they felt okay initiating someone into a sexual act. And so again, these while these conversations can be very difficult and be very traumatic to think about and bring up, and can be very uncomfortable, the intention here, and I'm going to repeat it over and over, is so that we understand ourselves, we understand our story, that these don't become further basis for us to act out and behave irresponsibly or allow our addictions to flourish, but rather something that we can use as a way, as a platform to connecting to Allah. That we can say, Ya Allah, this is what happened to me, and this is how it's affected me, and this is what I'm now doing, and grant me relief from it. With your permission, relieve me of my feelings around this. Help me regain a sense of control, a sense of empowerment, a sense of responsibility, a sense of self-esteem, of self-worth, etc., etc. So with this, we make the dua that Allah use our pain and turn it into a foundation on which we can build a sense of purpose. And so whether it's empowering ourselves, whether it's empowering others, so often, and you see it all the time, there are stories of people who haven't allowed themselves to simply be victims and have that be the end of the story. They've taken their pain and their suffering and they've done something with it. They've used it to empower others, to help others grow, to help others even just come to terms with the struggle that they have. And so there's a huge benefit in sharing your story, in not keeping the secret. So often I hear stories of people who have been abused and then didn't report it, and then come to find out that that person, the perpetrator, then went on to abuse other people. And again, their behavior isn't your responsibility, but you do have a choice as to whether or not you report them. So we make dua that Allah grant us relief from our struggles and an inner peace relative to these things, so that again He grants us understanding and compassion and an opening to act in more healthy ways. If you have any questions, any comments, feel free to forward them. I welcome the feedback. I welcome the questions. Further on in some of the topics, I'll cover some of the questions that have come through already. And you can reach out if you want to WhatsApp me, 084-8878681. I won't always respond immediately, but I'll definitely attempt to do so within 24 hours. Or if you want to reach out on social media, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, all of them at Coach Hanika, or you could shoot me an email, coach@ridwanhanika.com. With that, I say Jazakallah khair for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.